You've landed on The Substance. I'm your host, Philip Marinello. Here at The Substance, we're looking to have conversations that help us all better appreciate goodness, truth, and beauty. Previous guests include folks like Film Spotting's Josh Larson, Tyler Huckabee, Alyssa Wilkinson from the New York Times, Mike White from the Projection Booth podcast, and the Flophouse's very own Dan McCoy. This week on the show, I am very excited to be joined by author, screenwriter, physical media and cinema enthusiast and essayist and special feature contributor Megan Abbott. I've enjoyed seeing and reading and watching Megan's work for quite a while now. If you've listened to the show for any length of time, you know that I'm a physical media enthusiast. We talk about that here a lot, the importance of physical media. She's done a lot of great work in that space, and we talk about that a bit towards the end, but just seeing and reading her stuff over the years has been great. And getting to have her on the show talking about a movie she loves that coincidentally has a wonderful new 4K Blu-ray set out. This was just a joy. So I'm very excited to share this one with you. We love Scorsese, do another Scorsese. And actually Schrader, I just checked the Substantive Cinema list that I keep on Letterboxd. This is Schrader's fourth film on the show. So we've done quite a bit of Schrader, and I'm sure we will be doing more. And before we get to the conversation here, we would like to invite you all, unless you're driving a car right now, you don't even have to pause. Just open up your app, Apple, Spotify, Pocket Casts, wherever you listen. Hit the 5-star button. It really helps. If you're on Apple, we would invite you to write a review. It helps us quite a bit. And remind you, write a review for the shows you like. If you listen to other shows too, don't just write us a review. We would love one. But write them for the other creators you love as well. We recently had a new review from, I'm going to go Coco Drillo Coheat on iTunes, titled Good Stuff. As an atheist, I enjoyed the conversation with Dan and plan to check out more. Thank you. So that was always encouraging when we see that folks from all backgrounds, all sorts of people can find value in what we do. That's the goal. Obviously, we have things that we believe and think and that think are good. That's the goodness, truth, and beauty. But the goal is to share with others and to not proselytize or beat people over the head. So I was very encouraged to see that. Listeners, if you guys have any suggestions of topics, guests, films, personalities, topics that you would like us to consider covering in the future, you can email them to thesubstancepod@gmail.com. Or if you want to send something in like a voicemail, I believe on our last episode, The Life Aquatic, we had a voicemail. You can email those as well. Just take a little voice note on your phone, email it to thesubstancepod@gmail.com, and we will get you on a future show. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Megan Abbott on the Martin Scorsese picture, Bringing Out the Dead. Well, Megan, thank you so much for joining me. I've been looking forward to talking with you a while, and when I reached out, you were so gracious almost right away. You expressed interest, and then you sent me a handful of titles, and you picked a Scorsese one. I was like, yes, let's do it. Excellent. So great choices.
Yes, I think we're simpatico in our tastes, so that's always
Very much so. I mean, I have listened to you. I've read your Criterion essays for years. I've listened to you on Jen Johan's podcast and other folks' shows. You seem to be the go-to gal for the Coens the last few years with Criterion. Actually, the day of recording today is when I'm seeing all my cool friends who get stuff the first day share pictures of their No Country discs.
Yeah, that was extraordinary to get to talk to them again and about that movie. They're not always the most forthcoming, but somehow
No.
sometimes, but they've been so great with me, so I appreciate it. So I think they like to keep the veil, which I respect. Some filmmakers like to keep the veil there, and not to want to kind of explain what they think everything means, or all that kind of stuff. So it's always great when they do kind of let you in a little bit.
So before we get to Scorsese and bringing out the dead, there were two things. I mean, hopefully for the audience, but I'll just be frank and say, selfishly, I wanted to ask you about. You've talked about it several times because it's an interesting thing that people ask you about, but would love to talk to you briefly about David Simon and your time with him. Like and I don't know if you've given anything specific on this end, but what's your most memorable note or interesting little writer's room story? Do you have any of those? Would love to. He's
Yeah.
such a brilliant but also very acerbic and volatile guy. Like I feel like I'd love to have a coffee or a drink with him, and if it goes much more than 20 or 30 minutes, I'm not quite sure how it would turn out.
Well, it was a daunting writer's room because it was, of course, David Simon and then George Pelicano is the sort of, you know, like highly
Well,
regarded.
sure, and for you as a crime writer, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then Richard Price, who was just like a hero of mine. So was very intimidated. But they were all great. But they all had been working together, of course, a very long time. But I think they all, especially Price, because he was in New York, and the show is set in '70s New York, and of course he was here in the '70s and had written about it, so he would just tell these amazing stories, and it would just get you in that space, and he'd seen it all. So he was really the one that kind of kept us. It was the most lively and avuncular and charming, and David, I learned so much from him, and I was just quoting a piece of advice that he gave me yesterday. It's kind of obvious, but it is a thing you have to keep, especially when you're writing for Hollywood. You have to keep reminding yourself of, which he says, always go against the cliche, which I mean, you don't actually know you've entered the cliche, but your brain is going to tell you, because you've seen 100 movies, that this is going to happen. Actually, even if just as a thought exercise, imagine the exact opposite happens. And so, like, you really forces you to think about everything differently. And then the other thing he told me, which I think about a lot too, is that um this is like the Pixies version of TV writing, but that a noisy scene should be followed by a quiet scene, which should be followed by a noisy scene. So those two have really stuck in my head, and they sort of become one of that sort of handful of stuff that I keep over my computer to remind me.
And you've been doing quite a bit more TV over the last few years, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's just it's crime, no matter what the market is, crime stories always sell. So it
It's
does
true.
feel like, yeah, it's I think studio executives trust that genre is more than it's always a risk, and you're always taking chances. But as a kid who grew up watching movies, it is just it's impossible for me to say no when certain opportunities arise, because it was always my fantasy to be like William Holden in Sunset Boulevard. And,
Right.
yeah, and be filled with the self contempt that fill him. So yeah, I do work a lot in that world, and it's a good balance, because writing novels is so solitary, and
That makes a lot of sense. And the other, this is something that listeners know is a big favorite of mine. I was going back through doing some research. Things have been nuts lately, but I always try to do a little bit, see what folks have put out. And I was reminded I've actually looked at your Criterion top 10 list a ton of times over the years, because every now and then I just go through Sam Fuller's filmography and I just see who
yeah.
has written little pieces on it. And you actually picked my favorite of the Fuller films, The Naked Kiss, for your Criterion top 10 list. So I would just love to see. I mean, you mentioned, actually, a bridge to this, you mentioned Scorsese's journey through film, which got you on to Fuller, but would love to hear just briefly your thoughts on Fuller. We actually, on our show, we recently just did Shot Corridor as a companion to an episode I did with another one of my friend's shows, The Naked Kiss, where actually, I don't know if you know, they're still alive. they actually got interviews with Constance Towers and Michael Dante on our Naked Kiss episode, which is wild.
Oh my
But
gosh.
would
I mean,
love to, because I mean, you do noir, you do pulp, so I would just love to hear you talk Fuller a little bit.
yeah, that really was huge for me, and it was really when I was in my early 20s and saw that Scorsese documentary, and they showed the opening scene of Naked Kiss.
Iconic.
I mean, like you can't even believe what you're seeing. I mean, talk about someone who fights against cliches. I don't think he's ever met at, it's so over the top and operatic, and it all works somehow, in part because he's such, like a lot of reporters turned screenwriters. He has such a strong sense of story and character, and such a sense of like the power of like what we would, was pejoratively called tabloid stories, but by which they're about passions, and really primitive impulses we all have.
Exactly. The whole point of the tabloids is to pull at something and to make you pick it up. And
Yeah.
translating that to either the dime novels or to cinema is that's a no-brainer.
Yes, and I won't spoil the twist in Naked Kiss, but I mean
Oof.
it's pretty rare to get shocked like on that level by when you've seen as many movies as we
It's
see.
actually this year has its 60th anniversary. That was a
Oh
64.
gosh. I mean, it's sort of like you can't, and that's one of those where you want to have a little context, because if you have any context, you can't believe they got away with that Fuller got away with that revelation in it. And it's also, he's just I mean, he's like the master of the big swings. There's just like an incredible singing sequence in that movie that's
Oh
forget.
yeah, we spent a lot of time talking about
Yeah,
that hospital
the
wing
bird.
children lullaby. Very,
Right.
very Lynchian.
Yes, yes. And but similarly, he also, for me, his views, his ethics are in the right place. You feel in good hands. You don't feel like he's exploiting anyone. Um, you feel a real humanity in his movies and a sympathy for his characters, really almost all of them, which is certainly something you see in Shot Quarter, which is, still feels kind of radical as a movie.
Very much
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
Yeah, we just covered that, and actually, it's a little bittersweet now, post election day. But I actually wore my Sam Fuller shirt to go vote this year. Just I
Oh,
was like, my wife had some of her feminist shirts, and I was like, I don't really have anything to wear to vote. And then I found my Sam Fuller shirt, and I was like, there we go.
yes. I mean, he would have a lot to say about that
Boy,
election.
oh boy, man, I would love to have a Sam Fuller. Uh, and actually, so when we were talking shot quarter, this is we're gonna get to Scorsese here in a second. I was reminded, but also he's up in years there as well. That actually Spike Lee fits that bill pretty
Yes.
well as well. But we don't
Yeah.
have a lot of those radical stylists who are happy to use like the pulp, happy to go extreme for a simple message.
Yes, boy. I had not thought of putting them together, but that's actually makes huge sense because they do take those bold things and mix genres really without worry, and because they have such control over their tone, you feel like they know what they're doing. You don't feel like they're doing something just to, throw a curveball in there. At all really feels a piece of it. And it's a great way, like Scorsese would say about Fuller, to smuggle in all these. I mean, Spike Lee doesn't smuggle it in, but
Yeah,
but
Spike Lee's not quite a smuggler, but I do love that that Scorsese quote about Fuller being a smuggler. And it's like,
yeah,
yeah, that's what genre storytelling is. And we've actually covered, so I mean, for our show, our brand being The Substance and
yeah,
Substantive Cinema, we've covered a lot of genre stuff because, man, when you strip down, when you get rid of all the other stuff, you can tell a lot of really cool stories with genre that are also like the tabloid that make people want to go. You can have like your Spike Lee movies or your Jordan Peele movies or what have you, or even go back like the George Romero movies that have a strong social sense, but are also just great entertainment as well.
Yeah, no, I think something like the substance is similar. I mean that in the new movie, the substance
I know,
is
was very annoyed that nobody reached out. I was like, come on, it's right there. We got
yeah,
a nice little SEO hit, so I guess thanks for that. But I was like,
yeah.
come
If you
on, let's collab.
collab, yeah, yeah, exactly. But like a huge pulpy
Oh
presentation, but
yeah.
there's actually a lot in it, and maybe it doesn't all work, but you would so admire again that kind of bravado. And I think there just needs to be more movies, especially now. Needs to be more movies like that.
Yeah, in the industrial superhero cinematic sequels, requels, reboots, like, and that's another reason why crime is so great, because you can, those always sell. So I mean, I feel like crime is one of the few places where you do get to have some of
Yes,
those things.
yes, crime always pays.
So that's actually a pretty good transition, because this film actually does. I was aware of this film, but I don't think I'd ever fully watched it from beginning to end. So I'm glad you picked this, because I don't
Good.
have a whole lot of Scorsese's left that I haven't seen all the way through. But this was one that I had it in my head that it was a lesser Scorsese, and that's just kind of how people talked about it. Or really, honestly, more probably the fact that nobody really talked about it.
Yes, yes, that's right. No, and I think it was in that period, like with Kundun, where it, I think people were sort of
It's
drifting
like a
away.
joke on The Sopranos. Like nobody talks about
And
it.
that's the main, yeah. And and it was really like now I think people are starting to see as this key period where you have him really interrogating his own spirituality. I mean, this movie is full of that, and really looking within, and then setting the stage for the next era in Scorsese. I think it feels vital now. But yeah, at the
So
time,
much so.
yeah.
Well, and if you look at it as, I could be wrong. I don't have the full IMDb or Letterbox pulled up right now, but this was the final full collab of Schrader, Scorsese, and Thelma, I think, and
Yes.
it fits within those other three so well. The Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, Last Temptation. Those would be a great little marathon.
Yes. No, absolutely. And it's just poses what it would be like to have a regular good man at the center of that story. Um, and the results are really, I think, heartbreaking and wrenching in ways that the other two aren't trying to do, but it makes it so much more intimate and personal in that way. I think it's much easier for regular people to lock into this if they permit themselves.
Very much so. So, 15 minutes in, we'll say we're talking this episode, Substantive Cinema, about Martin Scorsese's 1999 film, Bringing Out the Dead, which stars Nicolas Cage as Frank Pierce. He's an EMT driver who is having just about the worst weekend ever. He's on a string of bad luck. He used to be called Father Frank because he saved people all the time, but hasn't saved anybody in a while. Is drinking, is depressed, is insomniac, is being racked with insomnia. He's just having a real bad time. And unlike some of Scorsese's other films, which the more I thought about this, it made this movie that much more interesting. He's not exactly looking for redemption. He is in a way, because we can talk about it. He's haunted in particular by the ghost or spirit of one particular young woman that he couldn't save. But more than anything, specifically, Frank really is looking for rest, and that's just something you don't see depicted quite as much. Usually, it's the the lust and the greed and the temptation and the fall and the redemption, but this really is about a man seeking rest through through quite the bad weekend.
Yes, yeah, no, and I think one thing watching it again, and I realized I looked on Letterboxd. I had just watched it in the spring, so but every time I have a different response. But this time I thought so much about what that rest means to him, and I really thought of it as a story about obsession and addiction. He's addicted to saving people, and it will not allow him any peace when he can. And it's really, he actually, if you view it as an addict story, that's what he needs to cure himself of that beast, because you can't keep going like that. You can't keep chasing saving people's lives. It's he's created this impossible task for himself, and to be this sort of savior, to give his life meaning. And you know, you it's quite specific and haunting for that reason, I think, because he is in some ways a kind of saintly figure, but he's so tormented, and makes a series of poor decisions, as my favorite thing in any story is wanting
That's where the drama is.
yes, that's right. That's right.
So it's interesting that watching the film, it's just kind of a roller coaster ride. But then when you sit back to trying to analyze it some, you realize that there are through lines, there are structures, there are acts in a way, but it's in no way like a beginning, middle, end, three-act structure or hero's journey or anything really like that at all. The through line through the movie is Nick Cage responds to a heart attack patient, and he goes to pronounce him dead. He tries a couple more times. He brings him back, and he's like, "Okay, great! Like I finally saved one." And he takes a liking a little bit to the man's daughter, played by Patricia Arquette. So like that's a thread that goes through the whole movie. But then there's like you could think of it as a three-act structure. I've heard some people calling it like a dark mirror of the Christmas Carol, and I was like, okay, maybe that's interesting. With his the 3 nights, the Friday, Saturday, Sunday, he has three different partners. They're all very different, wild experiences, but it isn't your traditional like, oh, he has a goal, he meets it. It's the journey for rest, which he hopefully finds. I mean, we can talk spoilers. This movie came out a long time ago. Oh, 25. This is 1999, so this is
Yeah.
25 years. It's good we're finally coming back to it.
Yes. No. And I think, you know, I've heard some people refer to it, and this does feel true. It is very Dante Divine Comedy. I do think it has a classical structure of a type, but not the kind we're used to anymore, at least. Because, as you say, those three partners he works with become these sort of they are
They're more
lead.
vignettes, like they don't build to anything.
No, but they get more extreme, and his behavior gets more extreme with them, which also is sort of because he's not sleeping, he's drinking, he's sort of entered this sort of different state. You know, it is I mean, the spiritual component cannot be underestimated, because this is Scorsese and this is Schrader, and
Hmm.
Schrader's the Calvinist, which is just like this close to Catholicism. So I think it's built in sort of naturally for both of them. Is that there's some seeking redemption, but it is mostly incident. The story itself, I think you're right. I think it's these characters that keep recurring. You know, some of the quote unquote street people. You know, and
It's
the
got a stacked supporting cast.
yeah, we extraordinary. And then that you sort of they all you know seemingly represent a different kind of ethical dilemma, or what does it mean to be a good person, how do we take care of one another, you know, in some ways. It's a morality tale, that's turned on its head and then torn inside out and then flipped, and I think that that lack of a traditional obvious structure is designed to keep you off kilter, like Frank is. And I think it's so effective in that, because you really feel off balance, don't you, the whole movie?
Completely. Well, and it's also again one of my favorite people working. One of my genuinely, and every month and year that goes on, I'm trying to shake the trees to get my contacts. One of my dream guests on the show is Thelma Schoonmaker. There's nobody like her.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't know what, I mean, it's hard to imagine what Scorsese's movies would I mean, obviously she didn't work on his first few, but they together they created this kinetic,
Magic.
expressionistic, hallucinogenic style. I mean, there's some scenes in it that you just can't even imagine. This it's
Because you
set.
think how different can each of these three vignettes, like an ambulance responding to emergencies, like how do you really mix that up? But they each one is very distinct in its own frenzied way.
That's right, and they use the music to help with that. But they also, this is, was made in 99 but is set in the early 90s, which is a time I was living in this exact, in fact I still was in 1999, living in this exact neighborhood, Hell's Kitchen, right near Port Authority. And to me, one of the intensities of like watching it is that it draws me exactly back to that time or place. So there's this like surprising specificity of what that neighborhood looks like, because you're right near the West Side Highway and right near Port Authority. It's like a transient place in many ways, and has still the deuce. It has some like really. It still had a
Sure.
lot
Oh,
of
very much. Yeah.
their feeling and the kind of general sense of street chaos that you still get
Very
in New York.
grimy.
Yeah, and the 90s New York really, really was that. So that feels all very grounded. But the way it's shot, um, Richardson's cinematography, with the way so much of it looks like a Ouija, like a tabloid photo, like with a
Sure.
flash on front. So you have this bright light illuminating everything, that starts to push it more into dream territory. So I think the sort of magic trick of it is how they edited it in that way, where you never feel like they have lost control of the ship. You feel like you're definitely going someplace, um, but you never have any sense of what's coming next at all.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about as a writer of both prose and television was about the character Noel, played by Mark Anthony. I like immediately I latched onto that character because I mean maybe he was working with John Goodman at that point, but that character was right at the beginning, kind of before we were like, okay, this is a Friday, Saturday, Sunday 3-day story. That character was introduced when they brought in Patricia Arquette's father, and throughout the movie, it really struck me similarly. I haven't seen it in a while. We actually have a very interesting plan. We'll see if we can execute it on the podcast for Silence. But that character really reminded me of the Kichijiro character, like the lost sheep kind of character throughout the story over and over. It's they know he's got problems. He comes back. He gets clean. He ODs like this and that. He's trying to do good. At one point, he asks he asks Nick Cage's character to kill him. And he goes, "Okay, yeah, let's take you back to the hospital and kill you." And he checks him in again to try to get him help. Like that's just such a fascinating character. And I wonder, like, as a writer, what do you make of a character and device like that in this type of story?
Yeah, in some ways he's sort of like Shakespeare's fool, except that he's not really even giving you. I mean, the cliche version would he would be spouting words of wisdom from this sort of seemingly unstable drug addict, but it's not that. But it is becomes the person, like how the other characters respond to him tells you everything about the character. So you have the sort of gentleness with which Patricia Arquette's character, who's known him a long time, treats him and gets him
Mm.
water. And then you have Tom Sizemore,
Oh boy.
who's the third partner with him, who is not so sensitive with him. And in fact, I read that those two actors, well, Tom Sizemore said he did not, they those two did not get along on the set. You could
Well, it
feel,
worked.
you could feel the
It
contention.
worked for the screen.
Yeah. So and there's something almost like, I was really struck this time with that, just the part you're talking about where Nicolas Cage, so sure, I'll kill you, we're gonna take you to this special room, they're gonna ask how you want to be killed. And it felt like obscurely like a kind of doubling a little bit. Not that the end ends this darkly, but that's sort of all Nicolas Cage wants, is to be taken to a quiet room, and enter the glory of heaven, in a state of rest. So I think he sees himself strangely in that character. So I think, yeah, I think to me that's the sort of function of the role, because he's not really given a much of a story beyond the basic story. So it's not like he's a full character. I think purposely he's a symbol.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it becomes this sort of ethical litmus test, I think, for all the characters he comes across, and Meg plays with your feelings too, because you feel sorry for him, then you're annoyed by him, and then you're sort of frightened by him, maybe imagining yourself on the subway with this guy because he's so unstable, and then immediately struck by his fragility. So it also keeps us again on that at razor's edge the whole time.
Yeah, I think with in this type of story made by these creators, particularly Scorsese and Schrader, um, not to not to make it a one to one, but I exactly what you said. It's our feeling. It is a litmus test, and maybe kind of like Roger Ebert talked about, like the empathy machine of this is us.
Yeah.
We all have our own weaknesses. We all have the things that we return to that we wish we wouldn't. We all scare ourselves sometimes with the things that we do, or the opposite, where we're not doing the things that we ought to be doing. We need other people to tell us things that are very obvious, or in some cases lie to us to help get us through
Yeah.
little bits where we can't be trusted, things like that. And that's what made me think of Silence, because that was so specifically about this guy's like quest for like faithfulness. But with Noel, it was more just like stability.
Yeah.
And the Schrader and Scorsese, and I would imagine the original writer, who would see people like this every day in his own community, trying to make sure that we don't forget to have empathy for the lost folks.
No, I think that's quite right. And it I think one of the interesting, and I suspect, though I have not read the Joe Connolly book, but I kind of need to now, because it has the smack of the real. All these characters, no one is uncomplicated, because when you start the movie, you think the Patricia Arquette, perhaps you think the Patricia Arquette character is going to be this sort of serious version of the manic pixie dream girl, where she just is so
Sure.
lovely and she's in this terrible situation, and Nicholas, Frank feels sorry for her, and she has her own mess, and her own complicated relationship with her sick father, and all of that it makes it feel, more true and real and grounded. And I love how it keeps doing that, including all his three drive, like they all, there's moments where, yeah, I mean, your feelings change about them every moment, which of course is what real life is like. um
Truly.
and that, yeah, I think it does sort of creates this sort of intensity of feeling that enables that empathy machine you're talking about, because you feel with them, and you worry for all of them at different points, and you especially worry for Frank because he cares so much, and it's not like grandstanding way, or he's not like the Jimmy Stewart,
No,
like
not at all.
version of this
Not at
where
all.
Jimmy Stewart, and I mean, he's kind of a mess, and there is something narcissistic about needing to save people's lives,
Sure.
um um that's it's sort of like, would you burn down a house just to put the fire out? It's sort of like he wants situations, in some ways he needs chaos so he can fix it. So there is something diabolical in that, but of course you love him because he's just this open wound. He feels for everybody. To him, no one is lost. And it's coming off Kundun, and certainly in light of Last Temptation, and then looking forward to the Silent, you just really feel Scorsese bringing all his feelings about what his faith means to him through that, and it's never simple. It's a tortured faith,
Yeah,
testing.
I on the Scorsese note, um, I'm thinking back to people talking about his cameo in Killers of the Flower Moon, and I always think about his little role in Taxi Driver. It does always feel jarring when Scorsese puts himself in his movies. It might have been different in 1999 when things were less media saturated, but the first syllable over the speaker system, where he was the first dispatcher, I was like, okay, well, there's Marty. Is he going to be with us like this whole movie? What was that like for you in 1999 versus now?
I mean, I grew up listening to his voice just be, in a different way than we would now, but it's so distinctive, of course.
So distinctive.
It's such a New Yorker's voice. It's that fast talk, the way he punctuates, I, of course, recognized it immediately, though I suspect a lot of people didn't now that you say it,
I
because
would think that,
you know,
especially back then, because
early, so it's pre-social media by a long shot. It's early, even internet. So if you weren't tuned into movie world, you probably wouldn't know his voice.
and now I feel like it's the stereotype of like the movie buff, like elbowing their significant other, being like, "Hey, that's actually Martin Scorsese's voice. That's the dispatcher."
Yeah, totally, totally, totally. And it's just, especially because that sort of that's banter is such a it's actually like an old Hollywood fast talking, that dispatcher has a real banter to him, a real like real actually it's like someone out of a Sam Fuller movie way of talking. It's like a
Yes.
rat tat tat.
Well, actually, kind of like the character he plays in Killers of the Flower Moon, like that old radio announcer,
Yeah.
kind of like, ah, have it like the ringleader kind of guy.
Yeah, and I think it, contextually, that's the purpose in Killers, right? It works on that. You
My
know who it is. Yeah,
devastating.
yeah,
Like I
yeah.
went back just to watch that. I've only watched it in its entirety once, but I went back to watch that, and it's devastatingly effective there. I think
Yeah.
it's a great choice. So I understand intellectually why people think it was too much, but I thought it was, especially given the arc of his career. I don't want to get off on a Killers of the Flower Moon tangent, but that was a 10 out of 10 perfectly executed moment for
I
me.
agree. I agree. And I actually think it's important when that movie is in a large part about the way we write history and the stories we tell. So to ignore that this is another person telling that story would be duplicitous, I think. And it would be smug to not sort of bring your big, remind everyone that this is someone else in some ways co-opting, for a different purpose, for hopefully expansive purpose, a story that isn't his to tell.
Completely agree. And then the other one where so Frank has three partners. His second one, Marcus, played by Ving Rhames, also within the first sentence of that dispatcher was like, "Is that Queen Latifah?" So I had to stop the movie, look it up, and I was like, "Okay." Like the dispatchers were a little distracting for me, just because like immediately I was like, that's a somebody's voice."
Yes, yes, and at the time too, I don't know. I mean, she was very famous at that time, but still, but now you watch it and you can't help but, though. I mean, we should talk a little about Big Rames because
Absolutely.
he's so good that you almost like he can't be in there a minute longer because he's stealing the whole movie. So
Ving Rhames's Marcus is a fascinating, super like, yeah, you can't take your eyes off him. He's all over the place. He's basically like he's such a interesting combination of contradictions with all the charisma in the world. And back when Ving Rhames was like the height of Ving Rhames.
yes, no, and sort of back to that same point about there's no simple character. He's in some ways like a preacher, and really has these convictions. But then he like, let's go look at the hookers coming out of the titty bar or whatever. Like he
Yeah.
which again is like real life, especially people that work in this kind of field. Whether you're talking about cops or certainly anyone in urgent care or
It
emergency
has to be
medicine.
very desensitized. You'd have to have a lot of social coping mechanisms to not literally lose your mind with all of the not just depravity, but just like hardship and human pain that you have to deal with.
That's right. It's like being in war forever. You have to have the battle wits about you and the gallows humor and all, and then you also do then have that junkie need for adrenaline because it's the thing that's keeping you going. And the way I mean, I love some of the details. I suspect too come straight out of the book. You know, so much is about where they're going to eat. You know,
John Goodman's character in particular he was cracking me up.
on the job talk, like that's like so much the center of everything. And all that stuff feels so lived in and real, which is a great counterpoint to how hallucinogenic some of the other, especially when we really sort of enter Frank's head, which are some of the most striking sequences, where you're feeling what he's feeling. You're not just seeing what he's seeing.
But one of the most standout individual sequences for me on the first watch, and it's one I've thought about a lot since, was the where he's with Ving Rhames and they go to that young person's club,
Yes.
and he responding to the OD of a guy with the street name I Be Bangin'. This movie's very funny.
It's so fun.
Um, it's some of it is very dark, but I was surprised, and I guess I shouldn't have been. I mean, Schrader is not the funniest person. Scorsese's got a great sense of humor, but this movie was way funnier than I thought it would be as far as an EMT bad weekend movie.
Yes, no, and and they're often combined, like that later scene, well, the balcony scene, with the
Oof, with Cliff Curtis, yeah.
is, yeah, it's so, it's sort of it's terrifying and funny, and then also feels really important, like momentously important at the end of it, you know. So you're sort of going through your whole cycle of emotion because you know, you're laughing, you're like turning your head away, maybe you're trying to cover your eyes, and then you realize, oh, this is actually, you know, a momentous moment for Frank.
So with the IB banging scene, he goes in. It's such an interesting framing, and I gotta believe in my head, I feel like that it probably, like you said previously, I imagine something like that happened. You have this guy who his affect is that of like a televangelist or a radio preacher, like he's got just he says everything in the tenor of like somebody with authority, like trying to impart a lesson. But then it's a very simple down the middle OD, but he frames it as like a revival meeting. He has everybody get in a circle, hold hands and pray, and then like slyly has Nicolas Cage's character apply Narcan like at the moment of revival or whatever, and brings him back. And like you go, okay, is this a statement about like religious frauds, or is this just a funny story? Like there's so much in there that it's just an interesting thing to kind of think about and talk about.
I think, I mean, it's a miracle, right? I mean, he's performing a miracle. It's a faith healing kind of thing. And I think, I don't think it is a fraud. I think he's trying to scare those kids straight.
Oh, he absolutely
Yeah.
is.
And I
And
think,
that's where a lot of the humor is, because these kids are all high and he is speaking with such authority. They're like, okay, yeah, let's hold hands, let's pray, let's listen to this guy. And whoa, he performed a miracle. He brought it back.
yeah, you're reminded these are just kids, you know, and it sort of, and it really is in some ways an allegory for faith. You know, what's important is that they believe it, you know, and that they might change their life because of it, which is really the purpose of miracles. Um, and I think the movie views it as a great act, which is what I love about it. It is sort of the way that he makes it meaningful. You know, the Ving Rhames character makes this job meaningful for himself, is doing things like
Sure.
this. Yeah, like with a later scene with the pregnant woman.
Yeah, man, oh man. I
Yeah.
was glad that had the end that it did.
Yes, me too, because I didn't think it was going that way the first time.
Yeah, I was like, okay, oof, oh boy, all right, here we go.
Yeah.
And then, as far as partner wise, we mentioned him already, but oof, last one we have Tom Sizemore, who I think it was last year maybe passed away.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful character actor. Always great as kind of a scumbag, and he really brought the goods here.
Yeah, you need it's the perfect. I mean, I think the three of them, John Goodman is the sort of warmest one and the most sort of real guy, and they
Just waiting for his next meal.
yeah, yeah, yeah. You kind of trust, you feel okay with him, and here when you by the time you get to Tom Sizemore, you feel like we're in trouble now. And then when he seems concerned about Nicolas Cage,
Exactly.
then you think, oh, we're really in trouble. And it's sort of in that way you do have the sense of a build, that feels quite like we've gone to the final ring in the Dante experience with Tom Sizemore, and that electricity he has. He's so chaotic, and it feels like that kind of opens the door for Nicolas Cage's character too. To he needs to get somewhere to get what he needs, and Tom Sizemore is the one to give it to him.
And Noel, like
Yeah, yeah,
the coming together of those two characters in the final part of the film. I'm sure these
yeah.
characters will circle each other going forward in the reality of the story, but having Tom Sizemore just decide, all right, like maybe I'm not going to quite kill this guy, but like I'm really going to let this guy have it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you feel this sort of built up rage. This is like that, this is their every night, this
Yeah.
is what their life is like, and these are figures that they are always constantly crossing paths, and you feel like this is probably 6 months or 6 years of accumulated rage, at the both each other and then the different versions of the other person.
Yeah, like Goodman's kind of like uh hedonism or getting by. Ving Rhames is kind of like excess, and Tom Sizemore is very much rage.
Yes, yes. And it's just sort of like the unleashed. It's sort of, I mean, now that Christmas Carol thing, I'm actually becoming fairly persuaded by the Christmas Carol analogy, but it makes sense because they are both sort of drawing on more biblical story structures, but you do sort of realize that these are all sort of facets of Nicolas Cage's character. And so you're sort of getting deeper into the sort of darkness at the center of him, and not darkness is necessarily a bad thing, but actually an important thing to acquaint yourself with. If you want to get very Carl Jung about it, you have to
Well,
you have
and like you
to
said, with the nature of his job, it isn't like, oh, this deep brooding stuff. It's like, no, like this is this is his job, is confronting this and trying to do his best to like be a help and to share some grace and to give to ease the pain of all of
yeah.
this darkness.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And you feel his sort of fragility, and especially in those scenes with Patricia Arquette, because he thinks he's being the caretaker, but slowly you realize she's the one taking care of him. Um, and I think that's, it. I find his arc, as sort of jagged as it is, so moving, because he has to go through all these places. I mean, it's in the Tom Sizemore section that I think is the only time you see him doing some of those things that Nicolas Cage. People who see a lot of Nicolas Cage
Oh
movies,
yeah, he does go a little nuts. And like you
yeah,
said, Tom Sizemore is so unhinged that when it flips and Tom Sizemore seems to be like genuinely concerned that Nicolas Cage is an unstable factor in his
yeah,
orbit, you're
yeah,
like, whoa, things are
yeah,
not okay.
yeah. This is not good for anybody. Yes, exactly.
But you were saying on his one of the things that I also really loved that I haven't seen in quite some time, and the only real reference I had for it was The Princess Bride. I got a real kick out of the whole the Dread Pirate Roberts kind of thing with his boss. He's like, "I'll fire you tomorrow." Like he's like, "I need a break. I need a vacation." Like he came in like very late for his shift, hoping to get fired. And it's like, "I'll fire you tomorrow. Like we really need you, man. Like it's bad out there." And he goes, "Well, yeah, it's bad out. That's why I don't want to do this job anymore."
Yeah,
But he's
yeah.
like, "Come on, just one more shift. I'll fire you tomorrow." Like, and I just thought that was again very darkly funny.
Yes, and I think it is sort of part of the addiction element. You know, they're all wired into the system, you know, that they can't escape. And especially because, unlike traditional addiction, they're doing something good and important. They're public servants. So in some ways, I think, and I've seen this before, even with cops, whether you think they're doing a public service or not, but they can't stop themselves as much as they want to, because um they're so they're so locked into this way of living, and they can't operate in the regular world anymore. And I think you certainly see that with Cage, you know, those few daytime moments we have with him. He doesn't know what to do with himself. He's completely unmoored when he's not working.
Yeah, alcohol or sharing a cigarette with Patricia Arquette are really his only uh, breaths. Or the one time where he actually does get to take a nap over at her place after they do their little
Yes.
drug cocktail over with Cliff Curtis and that crew.
Yes, that scene really reminded me of Schrader's Light Sleeper. I don't know if you've seen.
Yes.
Yeah, it was uncanny how much it really. I think it probably speaks a lot to um, the way um, drug dealers operated in 80s and 90s. I guess both 90s, um, New York. But the notion that you would go to um, their apartment and have your whole experience there, and nestled in the womb of the seemingly benevolent drug dealer. You see that also in Before the Devil Knows You're Dead, that Sidney Lumet
Oh, yeah, the
movie.
lament, the final
Yeah,
film.
yeah. Um, but it's fascinating to see Schrader play with that a different way, because in most
It's
ways.
almost shown as like a grace, like a good
Yes,
thing.
exactly. That's really what, which is, the fact that the drug dealer then returns, and we have this amazing sequence of them. It gives it even more. There's payoff to it too.
And
He
the
returns
beauty
with
of that final scene where Cliff Curtis is impaled on the guardrail, hanging
it.
off the side, trying to Nicolas Cage is trying to save him while they try to saw it off with a buzz saw. Like it's kind of like hallucinatorily beautiful. I was watching it on my TV at home. I was just like, wow, like this would have been wild in the theater. I would love
Yes.
to get a screening together of this in the theater sometime.
Yes, me too. Me too. Because it's such a striking and dazzling scene, and all practical. And he makes that comment about how much he loves the city, or I love New York, and you really kind of feel it, and you feel Scorsese in that line. But
It's beautiful.
it's beautiful, and it's like a second grace. He gives them grace. He gives him grace by getting him high and letting him sleep, and then by letting him save him, which is so interesting.
What you talked about it being practical, this was something else I wanted to make sure we covered. I was very impressed at the digital effects of 1999
Yeah.
with the I believe her name was Rose, the girl that Frank
Yes.
was not able to save, who is haunting him by as he's driving very kind of taxi driver esque down the street. Whenever it went into slow mo, and he's just kind of looking at the steamy, dirty streets and the mobs of people, he will very regularly see her face. Frank will regularly see Rose's face superimposed on the sick and the homeless, or even just the people walking by. And she's kind of haunting him because he hasn't forgiven himself for that.
That's right. No, it is quite beautiful, and
It's a
and
shockingly
yeah,
effective, like actual effect, because this is 1999. They're putting her face on all these people. It looked really good.
it
Or maybe
does.
the Blu-ray is a great restoration. I don't know, but I was very impressed.
No, I agree, because it is a delicate thing each time, because sometimes you see her face right away, but sometimes it becomes her face, but it feels much more how our brains work than
Hmm.
how computers work. It feels like it's almost like looking at a face in water where it's rippling, and then it comes into focus when the water is stilled, and I thought that was quite. effective and yes, dreamlike. And so much of this movie, it does feel like one long bad dream. It has a dream logic of repetition and things, not following the order they're supposed to be in, and all of that stuff. And I think that's one of the most effective quiet parts of it. That actress also is such um a lovely,
Yeah,
poignant.
very striking face.
Yeah, yeah,
And I'll say, listeners, if you have any, I mean, we've talked about the movie. You should see it. Hopefully, you've seen it already, but see it then. I want to talk spoilers of the final. Um, I, I loved how they tied it up together. The solve for Frank being unable to forgive himself for Rose is Frank basically pulling the plug on the man from the beginning of the movie, and kind of there was some sort of spiritual feeling allegory to where he put the nodes on his own chest
yeah.
to kind of get it by, squeak it by, like as the patient passed, and then he reattached them and kind of giving him that actually several minutes before the final scene. That was terrifying when in Frank's head he was basically hearing that character like plead for him to like stop trying to save him.
Yeah. Yes, no, absolutely. And I think, putting those nodes on himself is also like super Catholic. The
Yeah.
notion, it has to go, it's going through his
Like a
body.
substitutionary atonement kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, it's a kind of communion experience that's it's both, it makes sense logically. It's sort of a great, it's a great story device, but it doesn't feel that way at all. It feels exactly what Frank would do. And is sort of like you see it and you think, why didn't I see this coming? Because it all
Exactly. I was like, that is the perfect ending. I was like, oh man, that's because then you're like, oh no, this is a movie, and like that through line ties the bow like perfectly.
Yes, and then the words that Patricia Arquette says to him at the end, that what is the line? I have it up? Wait, I have it up here. Nobody told you to suffer; it was your idea, which is really the key, I think, to the whole movie. About he was bringing this. He was this is coming from him, this feeling like he's failed to save people, and that he needed to, and that he's fallen or lost, or and it's also sort of pointing out, and I don't mean in a negative way, his narcissism, which is also sort of a
Yeah.
super Christian kind of thing, that this
Yeah, the
is.
God complex of I have to save
Yes,
all these people. And
that's
it's like,
right,
hey
that's right.
man, like, well, and actually that runs counter to the actual message of Jesus at the time of like, my yoke is easy. Like, let go of your burdens. Like, let
Exactly,
me have that for you.
exactly.
And Frank kind of letting his burdens go as he takes on the burden for this man in a way that doesn't cause him any pain. Like, it's kind of like you said, when it happens, you're like, that is good writing right there. That is perfect.
Yes, it is that final image of the two of them in bed with the light coming in is so also super Catholic, to like a pietà, but so he's finally can rest, as you say, that this is
He's
all about.
entered in. Well, yeah, because right before he goes in, he sees Rose one last time on Patricia Arquette's face,
Yes,
and
right.
then he kind of does forgive himself in that moment when she says like, "Hey, like you don't need to suffer," and him accepting that is kind of he was in his own way. He was being his own worst enemy
That's
through
right.
these experiences, and Patricia Arquette's character. So we've been calling everybody by their names. I'm just dropping it. She is Mary, of course,
Oh
obviously,
God. If we missed the Christian,
obviously.
yeah, yeah,
And when Mary tells him, "You don't need to suffer," like
yeah.
that's it.
That's right. And she's saying it, in a literal sense, is the daughter of this man, but she's also speaking for for Scorsese, for the movie, for the idea, like we, as you say, like, yeah, relieve yourself of this burden. It's so funny because I heard someone talk recently about how all David Lynch movies are really about I can't find my keys,
Oh
and
yeah, I've been listening to those blank
yeah,
check episodes. I
yes,
just
that's what it's
listened.
from. Blank check.
There's
Yes,
so much that I was thinking about Lynch preparing for this because I just listened to the Twin Peaks episode 8
yes,
episode the other night, and I was like, oh man, like I'm just
extraordinary.
trying to separate my brain, but like Fuller, Scorsese, Lynch, they're all kind of
Totally.
in these things together.
And I think Scorsese's might be they're all just about I just need a nap.
Yeah.
He needs a break from his own sort of tortured Catholicism, his wrestling between the body and the heart and the brain, and this sort of it's just so wired into all his movies is sort of characters that torture themselves. Um and they have to go through this dark journey, go through the woods to come out the other side, only to realize this very simple thing that only Mary can tell him.
There it is. That's perfect. So where does this rank? And this is an impossible question. So, but where does this rank for you on the Scorsese pyramid?
It is impossible. I feel like this is like with
Truly.
Cohen. I'm constantly like anytime anyone asks me, I would. But what I will say is, I do think I would put it now in the stats as the most underrated because I used to say
Agreed.
that about After Hours, but that has now really come back. Ditto King of Comedy, which I think both those two are top tier Scorsese, but now I feel like they both found their great fans and admirers now, and now no one can understand why they weren't successful at the time.
Yep.
But I still think this has a long way to go. I saw this interview with Thelma Schumacher where she said that it was so misunderstood at the time that people thought it was a movie about car crashes, and it was really a movie about compassion. And I think this may be the perfect time for people
Yeah.
to revisit even today's news. And I don't want to timestamp this, but there's a lot
Sure.
going on all the time now where
There
people
is.
perhaps need to think about the care we take with one another and ourselves. And I think maybe it will, and now with this Blu-ray, maybe it'll finally start to get some real momentum, and with this podcast.
Hey, I hope so. Yeah, the new 4K Blu-ray is gorgeous. It might not quite have the prestige of like Criterion or Arrow or Kino or what have you, but it's really great. And I know a lot of collectors. I've seen some of my friends or some of the people in the physical media space talking about it. So
Yeah.
hoping that, because I would imagine the people who just know like Goodfellas and Wolf of Wall Street have never heard of this, like your average moviegoer. So hopefully this will put it on more people's radars.
Yes, yes.
This is a little random fact. We do have one segment here, but I was just very heartened, I guess. I don't love the whole streaming thing and what that does a lot to film. But on the other hand, I was looking at Letterbox today and I saw that Killers of the Flower Moon has over 1 million letterbox logs and The Irishman has nearly 1 million letterbox logs. So like,
Yeah.
okay, I guess if more people see it, I would still like to have physical discs and more than 6 days in the theater. But like, if it pays for the work to get done and more people see it, okay, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's the sort of devil's bargain we have now, and as long as we still are getting, these Criterion, of course, and Kino, but like some of these, and then the studios when they do it, but these smaller distributors. So as long as we can keep both, I guess it's just hard to imagine it just like the long term budgetarily,
I
of course.
don't like it at all. But also, like, who would have paid for The Irishman or Killers of the Flower Moon? Like, nobody's paying for that.
No, but also
So
no one's ever paying again for them. That's
that's
that's the
true.
that's the problem looking forward. And these kings and queens of that generation of cinema, they're the last that are ever going to get those kinds of budgets. But there's some exciting new stuff coming our way. I do feel like cinema is always reinventing itself.
Always,
Yeah,
always. But I
yeah,
also do love that we seem to be in a golden era for our senior masters, like your
yeah.
Scorsese's and Schraders and Verhovens and Maliks and like Ridley Scott, like they're all still cranking them out.
It's
So
amazing. In their
I'll
80s,
take them.
90s. Yeah, yeah, that is a true gift. And, as you say,
And they're
because
supporting the new generation
they
too,
are.
actively, a lot of them.
I do see it on Letterboxd all the time because Letterboxd tilts much younger. It tilts, I
Sure.
think, millennial and younger, and it's such a great discovery of vehicle for a younger person. Try, that where I saw the Scorsese documentary and discovered it
Exactly.
before. So
Their letterboxed is whatever they call them, the Gen whatevers. That's their Martin Scorsese's A Lifetime in Film.
that's right. That's right. That's exactly it. Good from Letterboxd.
Well, the one segment we like to do, Megan, is substance shoutouts. What have you been reading, watching, listening to, enjoying through various mediums that you've either found either personally edifying or enjoyable? It doesn't have to be terribly substantive, but it can. But what have you been watching, reading, listening to? What have you been that you want to impart to others?
Yeah, I do have one I would love to just because I feel like more people need to see it. But one of my favorite movies of 2024, which I just saw for the first time 3 weeks ago, is that movie Between the Temples. Do you know that movie?
I do
With
not.
Jason Schwartzman and Carol Kane. Um, it's a comedy about a
I think I
camp.
saw a letterbox log, but I was like, what is this?
Yeah, and it's actually she's been nominated for a few of the critics awards. It was sort of pitched as a kind of Harold and Maude, which it is a little bit, but to me it's closer to an Elaine May movie. It's a comedy, um, but Jason
Nathan
Schwartzman.
Silver. I'm not familiar with him.
Yeah, and it's made me sort of dig into his earlier movies. But he's a cantor who has lost. He can't sing since he lost his wife, and Carol
Okay.
Kane is a woman who never got bat mitzvah, and so they, I mean,
Aw.
yeah, I know, and it sounds like this should have been like a 1987 comedy starring Bette Midler,
Sure.
but it has the texture and feel and pace of a 70s movie like Paul Mazursky or Elaine May.
We need
Um,
more of those. I
it's
will
great.
always support like a movie where things happen to people, like normal people.
Exactly, exactly. And I found it like it's extremely funny, but also really moving, and very romantic. So I want to shout that out because you can get it on demand now for like $4, and everybody should watch it.
I'll check that out. Anything else?
What else? What else? Gosh, I've seen so much this year. I'm still catching up.
Any crime or noir?
Oh boy, yeah, everybody should who has Criterion, which is probably a lot of your listeners should be checking out the Columbia pre-code ones on there now because there's some I found that I had never seen, including a great one called Virtue with Carol Lombard. There's some really speaking of like smuggling stuff in, they have like these great lurid plots, and also they're always a mix of genre. There's a lot of comedy, there's a lot of people dying, and there's a lot of sometimes there's a musical number in them, and it's
Okay.
a great collection. So if people haven't, it doesn't have all the obvious pre-code movies that you tend to see a lot. It goes much deeper, and you get some
I
gems.
love the curation over at the Criterion channel.
They are incredible.
The one that I would highlight this week, it finally came to US streaming services, and that's Chandler Levick's I Like Movies from a couple years ago. It premiered at TIFF and then played in Canada for a bunch, but now it's finally on like Canopy and Hoopla, and you can rent it. It's a coming of age movie set in the 90s about this kid who's obsessed with movies, works in a video store, and wants to go to NYU to study film. And it's just a really beautiful, funny, sad coming of age movie about a little movie nerd. And it was fantastic.
That sounds great. That's new to me. Okay, let's go back to the 90s. I think that seems
Yeah.
like our theme. That sounds
Video source. Oh, yeah. This is all 90s. There you
yeah,
go.
yeah, yeah. That sounds great. I'm gonna watch that
So
definitely,
yeah, if you have Hoopla or Canopy, go check that out. Support your local libraries. Well,
definitely.
Megan, you are a creator with a lot in the a lot of fires in the oven. What would you say, folks? Hey, go check out. Obviously, you have a lot of stuff already out there. Point people to old projects. Tell people about new projects. What do you have going on?
Yeah, I got a book coming out in June, I think, called El Dorado Drive, which is a new crime novel that's set in suburban Detroit in the aughts, so a little later,
All right.
um, about women that become involved in a money making scheme. Goodfellas is actually a secret inspiration, but I'm developing it for TV with A24, so fingers
Love
crossed. I'm
it.
excited. Yeah, yeah. And I'm doing with Scott Frank. We're doing Red Harvest with A24 too. So
Nice.
Dashiell Hammett's Red Harvest. So
I
I'm
love Dashiell
excited about
Hammett.
both those. And of course, everyone should check out the No Country for Old Men
I was
Criterion
gonna say,
because
yep.
it's a great package.
I cannot wait to get mine. And I was actually, and this is why I reached out to you. I was excited to see that you were back on there. I've had a little bit of a beef with Criterion, and I know a lot of us physical media people have been. They've been pretty scant on supplements. I know we live in the capitalist society we live in, but I'm like, give us commentaries, give us interviews, give us video essays, like, give us something. So I was so excited to see that you were back, especially because the Coens are pretty enigmatic. Like you did the Miller's Crossing, you're back again, so hopefully maybe some rapport as they continue to put those
Yeah.
out.
No, I think so. And I also, for the recent Scarface release, I did
I
a
hear that looks gorgeous. I haven't got
gorgeous.
the
And
Scarface edition yet.
I have a conversation on that one too with Bill Hader, and he's extraordinary
Oh,
talking about Scarface. We talked about it. I think we talked about it for a couple hours, but I think it's 35 minutes on there. But
man, release the uncut Criterion. See, Criterion, this is what we need.
yeah,
Don't give us all this like, oh, there's two 5-minute special features. Just give us $40. Come
yeah,
on.
it's expensive, I know, and they are a family business. But of course, I work I work for them intermittently. But I think it is it is so great for all of us who still have physical media and Blu-rays. You do want to have that thing that no one else can get, that people can't just go on YouTube and get. And I wouldn't have never learned anything about cinema were it not for commentaries. I mean, I was of the era
Man,
that was everything. I learned
same.
everything. So,
I I
so
love
I'm all for
those.
it.
And I love the new cover art. Like that's not nothing. Both the Miller's Crossing and the new No Country. Those are both fantastic additions.
Beautiful. Yeah, no AI. No AI is involved.
Well, Megan, this was a pleasure. Thank you for your time. You're welcome back if you ever want to come back. This was great.
Great. I had a wonderful time. Thanks so much. I hope everyone checks out Bringing Out the Dead.
So that was Megan Abbott on Martin Scorsese's Bringing Out the Dead. What, like, I know I say this a lot, but that was wonderful. Um, I'm not just doing this for fun, to talk to cool, interesting people, but that certainly is something that I enjoy. Getting to talk with Megan as somebody who has spent so much of her life thinking about story and cinema and Scorsese and the darkness and the human heart and all these things. That was really a wonderful conversation, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Be sure to check out Megan's work. We'll have links in the show notes to pre-order her upcoming book, which sounds really interesting. I would also like to invite you guys, if you have the Criterion discs of No Country for Old Men or Scarface, like she mentioned, or Miller's Crossing, and you enjoyed our conversation here today on the show, post, like, tweet it, whatever. I don't know how many folks are still on Twitter. Blue Sky it, Threads it, Instagram it, tag her and say, hey, really enjoyed hearing you on the Substance. Great work, keep it up, something like that. That's always encouraging as creators. I'm sure even somebody like her who has won a lot of awards, writes best-selling books, that would be encouraging to hear. And I don't know if I've said this in a while, but if you are watching along with us and you are on Letterboxd, we are using the tag Substantive Cinema. That's Substantive Space Cinema on Letterboxd. So if you watch the shows we do, gonna have a list in the show notes of all the previous ones we've done. If you've ever watch along when you listen to the episodes, tag your review Substantive Cinema, and I think I'm gonna try to start reading some of them on the show, so I can just search by tags, search all of Letterboxd. It's not one that other people have really used, so there's not going to be a whole lot of confusion. So if you're on Letterboxd and you watch along with the show, just tag your logs and reviews, Substantive Cinema, and we can read some of those on the show in the future. As an independent show, we really appreciate everybody who listens and decides to spend their time with us. We appreciate you. Thanks for listening to the show. If you want to help us out at no cost at all, share the show. Text a friend. Who's your friend who loves crime novels or Martin Scorsese or Nick Cage? We all know somebody who loves Nick Cage. Send them the show. Say, hey, this is really good. Bringing out the dead. You could be the cool person introducing your friends to a very underseen movie. Say, hey, like there's this really cool movie out. It's not really streaming anywhere, so you could go to the library or check out the 4K Blu-ray that just came out. Be like, hey, come over. Let's watch this cool new thing. But yeah, share the show with your friends, post about it, tag us. We'll be happy to interact and share that as well. And it's just greatly appreciated by anyone willing to do that. And if you want to support this show and throw us a couple of bucks, you can do that in the Spotify link in the show notes. I believe you can do that at $1, $5, or $10 a month. As an independent show, that is so helpful as we are looking to grow. Or if you don't want to do a monthly deal but still want to throw a couple bucks in our tip jar, you can do that on Cash App, $ the Substance Pod. Maybe leave a cute little memo. Somebody did that not too long ago, and that's always fun reading those. It helps us do a lot of little stuff here for the show. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure back when this Blu-ray came out, and I was talking with Megan, and she said she wanted to cover it, I believe I bought that Blu-ray with funds from you guys. So thank you, listeners who have donated before. You're helping make the show. So thank you to everybody who does that. It's immensely appreciated. We'll be back in your feed in 2 weeks with a chance of a potential episode next week. But look for us in 2 weeks on your podcast feed. This year's off to a nice start. Got some incredible folks on the calendar. Got some really great returning guests. Some people that may or may not have already been mentioned in this episode, and some very exciting new folks as well. So it's going to be a good year. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing. I've been your host, Philip Marinello. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time on The Substance.
People wanted from Scorsese at that time or Nicolas Cage, but now people can just view it as it is.
Well, and especially it being a 1999 movie, I don't know if we're going to have time to talk about that in the show, but that was such a monumentous year that they're like, what's this weird offering from Scorsese? Okay, like I feel like a lot of people just haven't even given it a second look since then.
Yeah, I agree. So we can do our service.